This Quircast show is brought to you in part by the Jonathan_Foster podcast. It's a podcast that lives at the intersection of mimetic theory and open and relational theology, given that your host has degrees in such thinking as well as many of his guests. So if you're interested in helping humanity evolve and take healthy steps forward into non-scapegoating, non-binary, non-violent love, you should check it out. Find the Jonathan_Foster show on all fine podcasting platforms everywhere.
Just jumping in to do some recording. I'm not going to think too hard about it. Well, welcome to the Liminal Living podcast. My name is Dr. Tom Rundel, and I am your curator of conversations. And today is not a curated conversation. Today is just kind of a solo show. We haven't done a solo show in a little while. I've got some people planned out and some interviews happening, some pretty exciting things on the horizon. Next week I'm talking with Zach Lambert of the Post-Evangelicals. The week after that I've got Brian McLaren. I'm so excited to talk to Brian McLaren. We got Daniel Wolpert coming up, and a new friend, Ben Catt, is coming up. And so we've got some things, but I thought we'd just take a breather for a moment and give you some housekeeping updates, and I got some things on my mind also that I wanted to share. But the first update that you should probably be wondering about right now, because you probably heard the ads running on the beginning, is that I joined a podcast network called Quircast. It's through the publishing agency Quire, which I've been following them for a while, and they have a network of like-minded podcasters. So you'll be hearing some of their shows, commercials on this show. I'll be promoting them. And if you were to go and check out some other shows, you might hear a commercial for my show on one of their shows. But what this does is it connects me into a network of people who are like-minded. I'm really excited about that. It also gives me some resources I didn't have access to. By providing a hosting site, I moved off of SoundCloud, and now I'm on Simplecast with all the other folks from Quircast. We're in Simplecast together, and that frees up some financial resources to use some other cool and interesting tools. So you might see some videos popping up on YouTube and maybe some videos with some reels as I figure out how to use some new tools in the future. So that's on the horizon, some exciting things and some fun changes. I'll try to keep the commercials to a minimum, but they will give me access to a small amount of financial resources to use some different podcasting tools that'll make it, it'll put some short form things before your eyes on a more consistent basis and not just the long form podcast that I've been releasing. So you'll get some things in exchange for listening to some ads. And I hope that you're cool with that, because this seems to be the way the internet's going now. Everything has an ad in it, but we're going to try it out. And just doing some experiments and seeing how I like things. So those are some cool and fun things on the horizon. Planning out the summer, and I'm not sure what the summer is going to look like just yet, but I'm thinking of doing some solo shows mixed with some other interviews around a specific topic of how the church has used power in the most recent days, and maybe jumping into some of the apocalyptic passages from Matthew and showing how they actually apply to life and where we are, and not just in this left behind end of times kind of stuff, but really trying to put some better understanding around those passages. So that's probably the direction I'll go in the summer, and we'll see. But May is going to be exciting with some really fun guests. I'm looking forward to that. So I thought we'd just take a little breather here at the end of April, and I want to talk about something called cognitive biases. So hang on to your hats. We're going to jump in. So I teach a philosophy class to high school homeschoolers. Some families in our area got together and we created an inclusive, non-religious homeschool co-op, because since the pandemic, there seems to be a lot of folks doing that home education route and looking for a non-fundamentalist option of a co-op for their homeschooled kids to do events and dances and classes. So every Friday, I travel into the community center in my local town, and we have a number of high school kids, and we go through philosophy. That's the class that I'm teaching. There's other parents doing other classes that are in their expertises, but I get to teach philosophy. Now, my friend, Dr. Paul from Alabama, Paul Jones, I always run things by him like, does this make sense? Because he's the philosophy nerd. I talked with him on episode 2 of season 2, way back in the day when we first got going. And but he's like, oh, I can't wait, because you're talking philosophy now. You're talking my language. I usually talk mysticism and contemplation, and he's like, I don't get that, but I understand philosophy. And so he's been one that has really helped me see the importance of philosophy and taking things that are a little mystical and contemplative and don't make a lot of sense if you're not that bent already, and putting it down into the everyday experience of life. And so I have this awesome experience of teaching philosophy to high school kids, and it's been really fun and eye-opening. And this last week, we talked through different cognitive biases that the human mind creates to try and get at this thing called truth. But we never quite get to the thing called truth because our mind is constantly biased against us to find the truth. And so one of the philosophical questions that you can ask is, what can you be 100% sure of? And now the former fundamentalist religious person to me was like, well, I am absolutely sure that I am going to heaven when I die, or I'm absolutely sure of, my faith in God, or I'm absolutely sure of, and you know what? Those things, those understandings that I was absolutely sure of in the past, they have done a lot of evolution in the present. And so something I was 100% sure of was not necessarily the final, ultimate, be-all, end-all truth that defined all metaphysical reality around me. So things are constantly in flux and change. And so how can you be 100% sure of something if that thing might change and evolve as your life changes and evolves and experience changes and evolves? So we're never going to be free of all these cognitive biases. And when I have this list, I am using the list that Brian McLaren, it's kind of like preparing us in 2 weeks for listening to Brian McLaren. But I got this list from Brian, and he didn't make up this list, but he kind of compiled all these different biases into this really interesting, easy to understand list. And so there's all these different ways that the human mind is biased against the truth and towards something else. That is, when you're aware of these different biases that you have and hold, then you can see them in action, and then you're like, oh, okay, so I don't have to try and pretend that I'm 100% sure of something just because everyone around me is 100% sure of that something. If I'm not 100% sure of it, chances are you're closer to the truth than the person who's 100% sure. Because it turns out, you really can't be 100% sure of anything when you're in the philosophy realm. There's absolutely no way to prove that God exists. There's no way to prove that I exist to you. There's no way to prove that we're not just living in a computer simulation. So there's no scientific method that's going to get at convincing the human mind with empirical hardcore evidence that what we're experiencing is truth. So you can't be 100% sure of anything. And if you are 100% sure of something, it's probably because your biases are coming in and filling in the blanks. So you could be 86% sure of something, and then 14% makes you uncomfortable. So then your cognitive bias steps in and fills that little void for you and says, okay, there we go, 100%, you're good to go. So how can you be sure of anything? Turns out, we really can't, but we can come pretty darn close, and close is good enough in this game of horseshoes that we're playing here. So I want to tell you a quick story about Albert Einstein. Now, Albert Einstein, he's probably the most famous scientist in all of existence. Like we when someone's a genius, we just say, oh, they're an Einstein. Like it's like when you want to search for something, you Google it. I don't even know if you always use Google, but like it's become like the household name of genius, of science, of just being super smart. Oh, he's the Einstein of this, Einstein of that, right? Albert Einstein is an absolute genius. And he came up with this thing called the theory of relativity that pretty much took Newton's physical laws and said that explains a lot, but not everything, especially when you get really, really, really small on the quantum level and really, really, really big on the cosmic level. And so Einstein's theory of relativity comes in and gives us different laws of physics and things. And I don't really want to get into like what the theory of relativity is and how it works, because this is not a science show and you probably get bored and turn this off and move on with your life. But just know that his theory is what gave us modern cosmology. Now think about this. Only 100 years ago, we discovered that there's another galaxy out there called the Andromeda Galaxy. Before that, we thought it was a nebula. We thought the Andromeda Nebula was something inside of our galaxy. But then Edwin Hubble, the Hubble Space Telescope is named after, applied a mathematical principle that some of the Harvard's women human computers came up with. And I cannot remember the specific woman's name at this time. But she was a group of Harvard human computers that were archiving these glass plates of pictures of objects in the sky. And she was able to come up with a mathematical formula that was able to calculate the distance between objects on a grand scale. How far away is Saturn? How far away is that next star? And it comes by using the mathematical laws of angles, by measuring the star, the light emitting from the star on one season, and then when the Earth goes 6 months and is on the other side of the sun, you measure it again, and now you have a triangle. You measure the angles, you measure the distance of the two sides of the triangle moving away from you towards the star. With that angle, you're able to measure the distance away. So Edwin Hubble took this this mathematical formula and he aimed it at the Andromeda Nebula, and he said, wait a second, this is outside of our galaxy, the Milky Way. And so this is only 100 years ago that we understood that there's another galaxy out there called Andromeda. And now with the Hubble Space Telescope and James Webb, we're finding out that the number of galaxies that are out there outnumber the number of stars in our galaxy. There's near infinite at this point. It's humongous. This is all new, and this is all given to us because Albert Einstein revolutionized the way that we do science on a cosmic scale. And he wasn't sure the theory of relativity was going to work. And so he needed something that was going to help exonerate it, to prove it correctly. And what he did was he waited for the solar eclipse of 1919. And what he's able to do is, the theory of relativity says that when mass is clumped together in such dense things like a sun, that actually warps space and time around it. And so if you take a sheet like a bed sheet, and you pull it tight on all four corners, and then you drop an iron marble in the center of it, it's going to create an indentation. And that's gravity. Gravity is the warping of space and time around a large mass object. And so he figured out that that's how it works. It's not just that gravity pulls things down. Gravity is actually warping space and time around it in a three-dimensional way. So that when I throw that marble, there's an iron marble in the sheet, and then you run another marble along that, it's going to create a downhill pattern, and then the little marble is going to be attracted to that iron marble because of the indentation in the sheet, and it's going to go downhill towards it. That's what gravity does in space. So if that's true, then you need a way to measure that curvature of space. How do you do that? What's the biggest thing that could warp space and time around us? And the answer is our sun. The sun makes up 98.6% of all mass in our solar system. So the 1.4% of mass in our solar system is you and me and the Earth and Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus and Neptune and Mars and Pluto and Ceres and the asteroid belt and all the comets and everything else in our solar system only makes up 1.4% of its mass. The sun holds 98.6% of all mass. So that's big. So what he did was he took a picture of these stars in the sky, and he says, now if I can get a picture of those stars when they're behind our sun, then the light coming from the star to my eye should warp around the sun and get to me. And he says, if my theory is correct, but how do you see the stars in the daytime? You wait for an eclipse. And he did. In 1919, he had all these scientists all over the world he'd take pictures of the sun and the stars around the sun during the total eclipse. And then he compared the two pictures, and the light from the stars that were actually behind the sun were visible because it warped around space and time of the sun and got to his eyes. And after that experiment validated his theory of relativity, he became famous, and the theory of relativity was adopted into the scientific community. But that moment when Einstein saw the eclipse and everything was validated for him, we've done even work on it since then, and we've modified his theory of relativity a little bit here and there because it was kind of old. So we have to be like Einstein, where we can make bold predictions about what we think is true, and yet allow those things that we think are true to be shaped and molded by the experience of our human existence going forward. And so here's what I wanted to say today. The way to get at the truth is through the open hand. Because you're only ever going to be at the most 95% sure that something's true. And if you're ever 100, it's because cognitive biases are stepping in and filling the gap for you. So then you become overconfident or self-righteous. That happens. So the way to get at the truth is through the open hand. Albert Einstein opened his hand. He says, I think this is true. And he let the theory of relativity be put to the test. And now we've pretty much adopted it and modified it a little bit. But we have to adjust. We use the theory of relativity to adjust our clocks on our phones, because when the signal travels to the satellite in space and back down again, there is a slowing of time. And so we had to apply the theory of relativity to adjust for the time change that it takes for the signal to get to space and back to us, because time moves slower outside of the Earth's mass as it does down here, just enough to affect the time. So we put the theory of relativity to our phones so that we know what time it is. It works. It does. And that was Einstein from 100 years ago. So Albert Einstein was able to suspend his bias, put his stuff out there on the line, and make a call on what he thought was true. And then it came back that he received some validation. So if you're ever 100% sure, you're operating out of the cognitive bias. So what are these biases Thanks to Brian McLaren, we have a couple of them right here spelled out and defined. And so we're going to go through those now. So the first one is confirmation bias. We're pretty much sure we know what this one is, right? Like, we want something to be true or believe something to be true before it's been tested. And so then we go out to find the things that confirm what we think is true is actually true. And we dismiss the things that don't fit into that story. So that confirmation bias is a bias that is not open to critique because it has vested interest in something being true already and will look for the things that will confirm to the mind, because the mind is really anxious with things of uncertainty. And so the confirmation bias comes in to fill the gap that is creating the anxiety, to ease the anxiety. So confirmation anxiety takes all of this information that confirms we're true, we're tuned into it, we're looking for it, we adopt it, and then it tunes out anything that doesn't confirm what we want to be true. And it's a very rigid system because it achieves certainty by a cheater way, because you're only collecting the data that helps your standpoint or your view, and you're dismissing the things. This is like the straw man argument. If you've ever heard that term, the straw man argument is when I was talking with Justin Lee a couple of weeks ago and talking about how I did a paper in my bachelor degree that was it was like dismantling the arguments of an affirming of LGBTQ academic source. I constructed a straw man to knock over in front of my class so that it looked like I won. And that straw man is easy. It's light. It's not dense. It doesn't fight back. But it looks like a scarecrow. And so that straw man, you construct it, you knock it over, and everyone cheers for you. That's where you get that, because it's a confirmation bias. I approached that book with a confirmation bias. I already had made up my mind about what was true before I opened the book. And then I opened the book and I allowed my confirmation bias to then critique the new information coming at me that didn't fit into my understanding of truth. And my confirmation bias, that's what it does. So we do not accept information that's new coming at us. Okay, so the second bias is the complexity bias. It's simple because our brains prefer simple information over complex information. If I don't understand, like if you pull up an academic medical paper and you're reading it and you don't understand it because you haven't been trained in like medical talk and jargon and vocabulary, and like your brain is not taking in that truth. And then you open up a podcast that someone's on there talking about the health benefits of, this thing. That's simple. I understand that. And then my intellect latches on to the thing that's more simple to understand. And I don't know what to do with the academic medical paper. So I just kind of push that to the side because our brains don't know what to do with complexity. And so we prefer simple information to complex information. And what this ends up doing when this bias goes against us is that we'll prefer a simple falsehood to a complex truth. And this happens in church spaces all the time, where we just adopt like American Christian nationalistic folk religion because it's simple, we're drenched in it, it's easy to understand, and then we're going to dismiss like the rich heritage of the desert fathers and mothers and the creeds that they helped craft and write and the mystical writings that we're not going to do that, but we're going to toot our nationalistic horn over here because it's simple, it's but it's a falsehood. It's a simple falsehood and not a complex truth. And our brains latch on to what's simple first, even if it's false. So the complexity bias comes around and, bites us in the butt. The third one is a community bias. And this one is kind of like what it sounds, where it's impossible to see what our community doesn't see. Because we, as human beings, we are tribal. We need a place of belonging. We need a community to identify with. And we need a social identity, because when we're in a group of people, we have a role to play. People understand who we are, and they mirror like our identity back at us in community in ways that you can't get at when you're all by yourself. So being in community helps you see yourself, helps you experience yourself, because you're experiencing yourself as others experience you. What happens in a community bias is then your experience of yourself in community sometimes doesn't match up to what's actually true. And so you will go along with what your group think believes, because this is what we believe. This is what we do. This is how we act. And the church is going through, like right now, the community bias is coming out in full force, because we're seeing all of this abuse of power and corruption and the stuff that has taken place for years. And now like white nationalism is coming out of the woodwork, and all of this stuff is starting to creep out and get into the public eye. And the community bias says, don't look at it. Don't acknowledge it. Set up the straw man and knock it over. Because our community's identity is based on us not seeing all that stuff. And if you're wrapped up in that community, then you also don't see that stuff. Or if you do, they're asking you to not say anything, or else you'll be ejected from the community. So you have to believe in the things that the community believes in order to belong. And when your brain, the anxiety in your brain that wants to belong, adopts false beliefs to stay in the community, it can do so on the subconscious level where you're not even seeing it or acknowledging it. And this is how like cults work. Cults also work this way, where there is a strong community identity that you must not question, because your identity in the community's identity is like based on it. And so now you can't see the community bias because it's not getting at the truth. This is what we do or say or believe, or how we dress or how we act in order to belong. And you will reject truthful things to stay identified with the community, rather than acknowledge the falsehoods that can exist within a community and be ejected from the community. And a lot of the deconstruction movement today is labeling the community biases that we've had in the past, and then saying these were falsehoods that we adopted, but we couldn't see. Purity culture was a thing we couldn't see. Young Earth creationism, pseudoscience it was adopted in the community. It was a thing that we couldn't see, where our community bias was against it. Patriarchy was a thing we couldn't see, because our community bias told us to not see it in order to belong. But now it's just coming out in the more public spheres, and it feels like an attack on community when really the truth is just coming out. And so the people who are deconstructing and being ejected from faith communities are the ones who are calling out the community biases that have existed, that are being labeled and pulled into the public eye, and saying, I don't want to be identified with this anymore. Well, basically, the community bias is just falling apart for some people, and now they're getting at truth. These things do exist within our church communities, and they need to be addressed. So that's the third one. The fourth one is complementarity bias. I probably said that word wrong. Complementarity. I'll just keep going. Complementarity bias. This is something that says, if you compliment me, then I like you. If you're against me, I'll be against you. If you're friends with my friends, then I'll be your friend. If you're friends with my enemies, I will not be your friend. So you can see how this will bias you against things that can be truthful that are held in people unlike you, who are different than you. Because the complementarity bias says, if you're hostile to my ideas, I'll be hostile to your ideas too. And vice versa. There's a lot of that going on the internet. I don't know if you noticed, but anyone hostile to my ideas, I'm hostile to theirs. Anyone hostile to my political party, I'm hostile to theirs. Anyone hostile to my church community, I'll be hostile to their community. And it's a complementarity bias where we can't see just like the contents of what might be true in people not like us, because they might not be holding those truths in a friendly manner. And if they're hostile towards us, we will be hostile towards them, and we will dismiss their ideas. But nobody's 100% wrong, and nobody's 100% right. And so the person who's hostile towards you might have 5% of a truth about something that you could adopt, but we will not see it, and we will not want to see it, because there's that hostility there that then shuts the door between me and you, and I don't see any of the truth that you might have, because I'm biased against it because of the hostility that exists between us. And that's just basic human psychology. It's not like a right or wrong thing. It's just a thing that exists, and we have to be aware that we're hostile to people who are hostile to us. We're hostile to people's ideas that are hostile to ours, and we're hostile towards people who are aligned with people who are hostile to us. And if there's any truth that is contained in anybody who's not like us, who doesn't believe like us, act like us, vote like us, think like us, worship like us, we can't see it because we have that hostility. So that's the complementarity bias. And then there's the competency bias. The competency bias it's like this Dunning-Kruger hypothesis. I don't know if you've seen this. Like, when you first start out doing something, your confidence builds really fast. Like playing guitar. You're like, oh, I'm the most amazing guitar player ever. When you're like maybe on year 3, you're like, okay, I could finally play this song I've always wanted to play. And so your confidence is up. But then you get in a band setting and you're like, oh my gosh, they're playing like these major 7th chords. I don't even know what the major 7th is. And then all of a sudden your confidence drops. But you've gotten better than what you were. But you didn't know a major 7th chord existed until you saw it being played in front of you. And you're like, oh my God, I don't know anything. And then your confidence drops. And then it slowly builds back up as you get better and better and better. As you practice and you play, with other band members and things, you start to learn more things, and then your confidence is never as high as it was in the beginning. So it's like this funny looking sideways S-curve with a really high arc on the front end and then a really low arc on the back end. And that Dunning-Kruger's hypothesis, it says that you're believing that you're putting out better than your actual output that you are putting out. Because you don't know how much you don't know. We didn't know the universe was as big as it was 100 years ago until we knew that it wasn't, right? And we didn't know that we didn't know it. And so you don't know the things you don't know, and you don't even know that you don't know them. They're not in your capacity of awareness. And so you're going to be biased against things you don't know naturally because you don't even know that you don't know them. And so if you're ever 100% sure of something, how can you be sure that you're 100% sure of it? Because there's a billion things you don't know. Like 94% of our universe is made up of dark matter and dark energy. What is it? We don't know. We don't know what it is. But it has an effect it has a gravitational effect. We can see the effects of dark matter and dark energy out in the universe with how things group around and how galaxies group together. We know there's something happening out there. But it doesn't interact with light, so we can't see it, so we don't know what it is. And so scientists who actually know their stuff will say we can only ever be sure of 6% of the universe, because 94% we can't see or interact with because it doesn't interact with light, and we don't even know what it is. Like, holy cow, there's some humility there. So we don't know the things we don't know, and so that's going to bias us against saying, oh, I have all of this truth and it must all be true. And I'm there, I've arrived. But then there's like a billion things outside of our capacity of knowing and understanding. And I think this is where the fear of God comes in. Not that we're supposed to be like shaking in our boots that God might strike us down. But like, I fear the ocean. Like, I went to Oregon for my doctoral classes, and we were right on the Pacific Ocean, and the thing was beautiful, but it was terrifying. Like, the waves were, I thought Lake Michigan had big waves, but holy cow, the Pacific Ocean was terrifying. Like, you can't get in it, you can't swim. If I don't have a fear and respect for the ocean, like, it's going to take me down. Now, God's not going to take you down, but you have to understand that God is vaster than the ocean. God will never fit inside of your brain. You then immerse yourself into God. That's like, this fear is not a fear that you might die in God's presence or that you might be strict down because you're not good enough. All of that was like religious trauma stuff that we need to give away, not hold on to that anymore. But there is like this reverence when it comes to intellectual knowing. And I think some of the theo bros out there that really like to like get into theology and like argue and debate people and then use like toxic masculinity to kick people over, that strawman people over, like, they need more fear of God in them, because you will never fit God inside of your brain. You can never be as sure as some of these theo bros out there trying to kick over strawmen and, you know, make fun of people who are not theo bros. Like, there needs to be a lot more fear of God, because you can never fit God in your brain, but you can immerse yourself into the mystery that God is and never comprehend God. And there's a consciousness bias. Some things just can't be seen from where you are at this place. That's why I have this podcast. Like, I'm talking with people and they're telling me their stories from their vantage points, stories of deconstruction, stories of experiencing racism, stories of experiencing power abuse, things I can't see from my vantage point. I need to hear others' stories. And I have a consciousness bias. There's only so many things within my sphere of consciousness. And that doesn't mean that my consciousness contains all of reality, right? Like, I need to talk to other people unlike me with experiences not like me that are outside of my consciousness, so that my bias is not just me and my way of seeing the world is right. Did you know that we are all addicted to the way we see the world? We all think that if everybody would just do it my way, then the world would get on because I have it figured out. Just do it my way. Just believe my way. Just think my way. That's a consciousness bias, and we need to kind of ditch that by the road, because there are other human experiences of other human cultures, of time and space and geography, that need to shape us and take the hard edges off of our fundamentalist understandings of things, and the extreme edges, like knock those extreme edges off, as Chad Ball said. I think that was last week. Yes, that was last week. Because there's only so many things that's going to fit in your consciousness right now, but that consciousness does not contain all of reality. So it's time to acknowledge that. And then there's the comfort bias. The comfort bias is that you prefer to not be disturbed. You'd rather stay comfortable. You don't like discomfort, you don't like pain, and you don't like inconvenience. That's a natural psychological bent we all have. But you can also have that when you're trying to collect the things that are true. You can have a comfort bias, and you will only adopt the things that keep you complacent, or the things that are convenient, or the things that are understandable. And you have this bias in you that says, I want to be comfortable and I want to have everything all figured out inside of my brain. And we prefer that. And so it biases us against truths that are uncomfortable, truths that are inconvenient, and truths that might cause us pain. You know, if you listen to the episode with Allie Henney, she said some really hard things towards white supremacy that makes people uncomfortable, because we have a comfort bias to us that says, I don't like things that make me uncomfortable, therefore Allie Henney must be wrong. And no, she's not wrong. She's just occupying a space outside of your consciousness bias, and it's uncomfortable for us, and we need to hear the things that make us uncomfortable sometimes, because the truth can lie in it and reside in it. The truth can reside in those things that make us uncomfortable. And we need to, if we want to get closer to the truth, then we might have to let go of the things that make us comfortable sometimes and adopt some inconvenience and discomfort and listen to stories that make us uncomfortable. That needs to happen. The 8th one is the conservative liberal bias. My political leanings help me see some things and make me miss entirely different things. I don't think I got to explain this one very much because it's on full display in our political shit show that is American politics right now. We have the conservative liberal bias. Everyone's polarized, arguing, and bipartisan. Anything is like impossible. And I'm not a politician. I don't know the way out of it, but there are also different things in the conservative liberal bias that socially lean us in certain directions, and we will be open to one side more than the other usually, and your leanings will determine where you're going to go for your news, who you're going to curate into your Facebook feed and all that stuff. And we will have a bias of conservative or liberal within us. And it doesn't mean the conservative party, the liberal party, even outside of politics, just the way of thinking and the philosophy that is them, neither one contains all of the truth. And when we're biased towards one, we will not hear the truths that could exist in the other side. And it makes bipartisanship absolutely impossible. So there's the conservative liberal bias. There's the catastrophe bias. This one's fun, where you remember dramatic catastrophes and then you expect them to keep happening. You don't notice gradual improvements or gradual declines. And so you're always looking for the big catastrophe on the horizon that's going to change and shake things up. And this comes from PTSD sometimes, or trauma, where we have trauma responses or triggers where we're just expecting the bad to happen. It's right on the horizon. Or we're expecting the dramatic good to happen, and it's just on the horizon. And you don't get caught up in the actual lived experience of this present moment. It's always the rescue's about to come or the world is about to end. And we have that catastrophe bias that it doesn't help us sink into this present moment at all. And notice how things are gradually getting better or how they're gradually getting worse. We're always looking for the big dramatic thing. And we never get to the truth of this moment, where you could probably start working out today, but you're waiting, for that big, Bowflex system to be delivered. But could you, sit in a chair and do some leg lifts in a chair? There's we could do that. But you're waiting for the big thing to happen before you're going to get started. You're not going to get at the truth of this present moment. So catastrophe bias, that's a fun one. And there's contact bias. When people lack meaningful contact with another person, then we develop prejudices in our minds and false assumptions. And they can go unchallenged when we don't converse with people from the liberal bias, conservative bias, or from that consciousness bias. We start to develop prejudices against other people that we're not in contact with, that we're not talking with, which is why I like to talk with all different kinds of people. I'll have someone on like Chad Ball, who I'm a universal restorationist. He's I know it's not, he used a different word that wasn't annihilation. Conditionalist, that's the word. He's a conditionalist that believes the soul ceases to exist. I believe that all souls are eternal and will eventually get there one day. That's a different, but he had great information to share. I wanted to hear his information. I wanted to hear his story. I want to hear where he's coming from. He has a different place of standing in the world than I do, a different upbringing. And I want contact with people that have great information and great stories and great souls. And I don't want just people that 100% agree with everything that I believe and how it believes. I don't want to put people on here that would share harmful things, but I need to hear different stories of different people. And so I got to go against my contact bias. If I just displayed people that I 100% agreed with everything that came out of their mouths, then that just shows that I'm biased in this podcast with, who I'm going to throw out there. but I'm very careful of who I curate for y'all too. So there's like this play that happens there. But when I don't have contact with that other person, I can develop prejudices and false assumptions. And then that inhibits my ability to see what is true in this moment because I don't have contact with things outside of my realm of experience. Now, are there some overlaps between all of these? Yes, there is. But it is, this contact bias has its own thing with prejudices and false assumptions. And then there's the confidence bias. We're usually attracted to people with confidence, even if they're wrong. I think the Republican Party's attachment to Donald Trump is there because he's just like flagrantly prideful, arrogant narcissist. And we are attracted to confidence. And for some reason, the evangelical Western American church has latched on to this man. And I think there's something there. There's the confidence bias being played out there, where we believe someone if they say it confidently, even if it's false. And we prefer the bold lie to the hesitant truth. And so we are apt to buy into con artists and con men and marketers and political people, and even podcasters sometimes are like, oh, they're saying it with so much confidence. And we're like drawn to other people's confidence. And it's not just Donald Trump and evangelicalism. Like, humans are drawn to confidence. If there's someone in the room that knows how to control a room, we're drawn to that person. You know, the life of the party, we call them. You know, they know how to work a room. They're the good marketer. There's nothing wrong with, being a marketer if that's your job. It's just sometimes when we are attracted to something just because it's said confidently, it doesn't mean it's true. But we assume it's true because they said it with such force. And so we have that confidence bias. And there's the cash bias. This one, it's hard to critique something or even see the flaws of something when I'm making my living from it, when I get a paycheck from it, when its existence matters to my well-being, not just cash, but there's a conflict of interest that's present. It's hard to make someone see something when their way of being and living and identifying and even perhaps making a living depends on them not seeing it. And so they have this bias against critiquing a system. That's why a lot of people do not like the deconstruction movement, because it's critiquing a system. And the system itself, they're like, no, my well-being, my community, my school, my place of worship, there's so many things that we wrap into this community of church. And when we critique it, some people get really, really, really mad. And it's because of the cash bias, not because they're getting paid from it. Sometimes they are if they're on staff here. But there's a conflict of interest. If you're critiquing the system that I'm involved in, then that's, you're saying that my community is going to fall apart, or this school that my kids go to that's a Christian school. Like, you're critiquing the thing that I built my life around, and I don't want to see that. I don't want to experience that, and so I will retaliate against you. And so a lot of the pushback on the deconstruction movement, I think it comes from that bias, that we're just critiquing something that people's lives have been wrapped around. But if we want to get at truth, we need to get beyond the biases and get at what's actually there. And the last one, we made it, guys. We made it. I'm so proud of you. We got here. The last one is the conspiracy bias. The conspiracy bias says that under stress or shame, our brains will become attracted to stories that relieve me of guilt or exonerate me of guilt or present me as an innocent victim with all these malicious conspirators out there. I think the QAnon one is just, it's an easy one to point to, obviously, because it's like all these conspirators out there that are trying to make, I'm just an innocent victim of it. When, you know what? I don't think that conspiracy exists. There's no facts behind that. It's a weird thing. But there's other conspiracies that we will hold on to because we don't want to be guilty. if we listen to the Allie Henny episode and then we get all big feelings and offended, and worked up and push back and say no, we want to be exonerated from the guilt that we're experiencing. And if anything comes up that maybe puts a finger on something that we might be feeling a little bit of guilt and shame over, we like overreact 10 times to like compensate for that. So I think a lot of the white fragility is wrapped up in here. And that is something that we got to get over. We got to be able to look at the truth of things as they are. So that is the conspiracy bias, and that is all 13 biases as Brian McLaren spells those out. So what are you 100% sure of? Why are you 100% sure of it? And how can you take something from 100% sure back down to maybe 85 and get over the biases that you're experiencing and maybe get at truth? Because I guess the thing that I'm most confident of is the way to get at truth is through the open hand. Because you can never only be 95% sure of something that's true. And if you are 100% sure of something, it's probably because one of those biases came in and filled the gap to make you feel comfortable again. So I know it's an uncomfortable thing to experience all of these different biases and have them kind of just spelled out, but I think they're helpful. And we don't have to get all big feelinged and offended and hurt and feel shame and guilt. What we just have to do is just see and become aware of how we're biased in all of these ways, and just get at the truth with an open hand, not clench down on everything that we want to be true or hope is true, and just kind of hold things in an open hand, let it come and let it go. And those are the biases. So thank you for sticking with me on this solo episode of the Liminal Living podcast. I hope you're liking the new format. We're going to be playing around with some stuff and experimenting with some stuff and seeing what happens. So next week, we're talking with Zach from the Post-Evangelicals. It's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. And we will put that episode out next Wednesday for you all. And then after that, we have Brian McLaren, which I'm pretty geeked about. I've been listening to his stuff for, 20 years now. I first was hostile towards Brian because I was a fundamentalist, and now I'm open to Brian, and I'm like, oh wow, look at all my biases that I was biased against him. And he's taught me a lot of stuff, so it'll be good to finally talk to him face to face. I'm excited, and I'm excited to share that conversation with you. So have a blessed week, and we'll see you next time out. Peace out.